Daniel Rabe, sir. Good morning, all. We are waiting for our Honorable Vice Chancellor to join with us. Namaskar. Vakratunda Mahakaya Suryakoti Samaprabha Nirvignam Kurume Deva Sarvakari Susarvada. Honorable Vice Chancellor of Kumar Bhaskar Burma Sanskrit and Ancient Studies University, Professor Deepak Kumar Sharma sir, respected Registrar Dr. Hemendra Sharma sir, respected Controller of Examination Dr. Sushanta Kumar Kaishyap sir, respected Chief Guest and Resource Person of today's webinar, respected Chairperson, and my dear colleagues and my dear participants. A very good morning to all of you present here. On behalf of the Department of Philosophy, Kumar Bhaskar Burma, Sanskrit and Ancient Studies University, I, Dr. Papuri Borua, feel very privileged to welcome you all to this one-day international webinar on existential crisis during COVID-19 pandemic. So the objective of organizing this webinar is to discuss about the crisis of human existence during this pandemic. Ladies and gentlemen, as we all know that coronavirus outbreak in the worldwide has completely changed the life of human being. So it leads people in having difficulty in making sense of one's own existence and also question the life of meaning as livelihood. So existential crisis that happens to people upon realization of imminent death, loss of meaning and security makes people completely helpless outwardly and inwardly as well. So when the capacity to respond outwardly is limited, as in the case of COVID-19, so in this situation, philosophical thinking and especially philosophy of existentialism teaches much about to respond inwardly. So the purpose of today's webinar is actually mainly lay focus upon the issues related to human existential crisis during this pandemic. To discuss this sensitive topic of today's webinar, we have invited three distinguished academicians from different institutions. So I would like to introduce them in front of you. We have invited as chief guest and keynote speaker, Professor Bijoy Hatiborua sir. He is from Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, Indian Institute of Technology, Delhi. And we have also invited Professor Nirmalya Narayan Chakraborty sir from the Department of Philosophy, Rabindra Bharati University, Kolkata. And we have invited Professor Daniel Rabe sir from the Department of Philosophy, Tel Aviv University, Israel. Sir, I welcome you all to this today's one-day international webinar. Now, I would like to request our respected Dr. Vikas Bhargav Sharma sir, HOD of the Department of Philosophy of KBVS University, to deliver a welcome address. Sir, over to you. Sir, you are not audible, sir. Sir, please mute yourself. Sir, wait, you are not audible. Okay. Okay, now you are audible, sir. No.
Sorry to interview, sir. Hello, because sir. Hello. Hello.
Because sir, you are not audible, sir. Because sir, please unmute yourself.
Because, sir. Hello. Because, sir. Sir. Hello, because, sir, you are not audible. So sorry for technical inconvenience. On behalf of the Department of Philosophy, I, Dr. Papori Borua, would like to welcome you all to this one-day international webinar. Now, I would like to request our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Deepak Kumar Sharma, sir, to say a few words on this occasion and inaugurate this program formally. Sir, over to you.
Hello. Thank you, Dr. Papori. Sarvebha Sarvabacha Namo Namaha. My greetings to all of you. Respected Professor Vijay Hatibura from IIT Delhi, my esteemed friend Professor Nirmal Narayan Chakraborty from Ravindra Bharati University, Kolkata, respected Professor Daniel Rabe from Tel Aviv University of Israel, my colleagues, both administrative as well as academics of our university, other non-teaching staff of our university, my dear participants representing various universities and colleges, research scholars, and my dear student friends. It is indeed a pleasure on my part to meet you all in this Herschel platform uh, arranged by the Department of Philosophy of our university. On behalf of the university, I take the opportunity of welcoming all of you to our midst. Friends, we have gathered here today for deliberation on a very relevant and timely issue, that is existential crisis during COVID-19. At the very beginning, I would like to tell you that I am neither a philosopher nor a psychologist. So what I would like to share with you will be a common man's feeling. Let's see that we human beings are a very blessed people on the globe, in this planet, because we are rational beings. We have we are endowed with cognitive faculty. We can think, we know to think about our past, our present, and also our future. We know to think about ourselves, our neighbors, our surroundings, so on and so forth. So this thinking, which is a process of mind, stage of mind, this leads to two kinds of consequences, as I would like to say. The term may not be philosophical or psychologically approved, but the consequences may be either positive or negative. If these consequences are positive, then it's okay. There is nothing to be worried over. But negative consequences or negative thinking, thoughts, give rise to very harder, serious, or grave issues or stages. It leads us to some serious stages. Anxiety, stress, and depression. These are actually a result of such negative thinking. And what we understand by this existential crisis, whenever a man begins to think about the negative aspects of life, or he or she fails to understand or to assess the meaning or value of life, then he may face certain crisis, and this crisis is what we call existential crisis. There may be various reasons. I think this is a topic which is discussed in philosophy and which is discussed in psychology as well as in psychiatry. And there may be various reasons. This is a common experience that anxiety, stress are the part and parcel now, are becoming part and parcel of modern people. Sometimes some negative, guilty feelings leads to certain such stages. Sometimes losing one's beloved person, loved one, may rise to some negative thinking. Whenever a person thinks that he or she is socially experiencing social dissatisfaction, it can also lead to some crisis. And dissatisfaction on his own performance becomes the cause of, in certain cases, of such crisis. And we find that there are people who are having no freedom, who feels that he is not having no freedom and responsibility, and who feels that he is not having no freedom and responsibility, and who feels that he is not having no freedom and responsibility, and who feels that he is not having no freedom and responsibility, and who feels that he is not having no freedom and responsibility, and who feels that he is not having no freedom and responsibility, and who feels that he is not having no freedom and responsibility, and who feels that he is not having no freedom and responsibility, and who feels that he is not having no freedom and responsibility, and who feels that he is not having no freedom and responsibility, and who feels that he is not having no freedom and responsibility, and who feels that he is not having no freedom and responsibility, and who feels that he is not having no freedom and responsibility, and who feels that he is not having no freedom and responsibility, and who feels that he is not having no freedom and responsibility, and who feels that he is not having no freedom and responsibility, and who feels that he is not having no freedom and responsibility, and who feels that he is not having to carry over, he faces similar situations. He thinks that whatever I am doing, it is useless, meaningless. Sometimes the loss or death of his beloved person, father, mother, wife, husband, children, close friends, can also become the cause of one's finding that life is meaningless. Especially after 50, after the age of 50, or after those people who are working in government or private sector who retires after the age of 60, they begin to think that I am 60, how many years I will live? It is meaningless. Oh, it is meaningless. What is the purpose of my life now? My job is over, children are grown, this and that. And sometimes one feels that he is having an isolated life, isolated from his family members, isolated from his neighbors, isolated from his friends, and he feels a grave situation owing to this disconnect. This can also lead to some kind of crisis, which we can say that this is also one kind of existential crisis because that person fails to undermine the value of life, the meaning and purpose of life. My dear friends, as I told you, I am not an expert on this subject, but what I feel that all these negative thinkings lead to what we call OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. And this is a globally uh, seen problem, which is found amongst the urban people as well as the rural people too. Uh, and serious attention should be paid to such people. My dear friends, there are problems, and but these problems should be sorted out. There should be some kind of solution. Psychologists and psychiatrists may help us to uh, maintain the normal, to attain the normal station. But if one fails to respond out of his own, then external people will not be of good use for him or her. We see that in many cases, most cases, thoughts are controlling us. Our thinking controls us. But try to see that I am thinking my thought. I am controlling my thoughts. I am regulating my thinking. Then it becomes easier uh, to check some of the negative issues. And it is our human habit that we always count on our failures. Yeah, I have done such only. I have a small house. My neighbors are having big buildings. But how much strain, how much labor, how much honesty I have maintained for building my small house, but small but beautiful, small but peaceful house. We fail to assess that. We look at the achievements of others and fail to look at our own achievements. This is not a good thing. And whenever a person becomes focused upon himself or herself, it is not a not a welcome situation. We should always try to find that what is the meaning and purpose of my life. I do not live for myself alone. I have my parents, I have my children, I have my other family members, I have my friends, I have my colleagues. I have duties and responsibilities to share with them. If we try to maintain that feeling or emotion or thinking, the crisis can be minimized. And another very important thing, as I understand, we should we always try to have a ready-made answers to all all our problems, solution to all our queries, doubts. My dear friends, as, a, uh, as an average person in academics, I dare to say that nothing is 100% perfect. Even the findings of great Einstein formula was also, it was questioned. So you should try to maintain such a feeling that yes, I know that solution to all the problems is not possible. If I become mentally ready for such a situation, then it becomes easier to sort out some of our problems. My dear friends, as I told you, some three very expert persons representing three very prestigious universities, institutions of the country, and one my friend from Daniel from Israel. They are here very much here to share their expertise with us. But what I feel that it becomes easier to sort out or to check our negative thinkings to solve, to minimize the problems of our crisis if we try to find out the meanings of our life. I told to some of my student friends earlier that you see, our life is a journey. Life is a journey, and the starting point is B. B, not the A. B, from the alphabet, English alphabet, A, B, C, D. The journey starts from B, and the last point is D. B and D. It is a journey. Life is a journey between B and D. B for birth and D for death. Let's see that in between there is C. So let's see that birth, my life begins from my birth, and regarding my birth, I have no control, I have no choice. I was born to my parents. And D for death. D for death. I am here for 50 years, 60 years, 70, 80 years, 90 years, like that. And I don't know on which day I will die. I will leave this world. So regarding this D, that is death also, I don't have any control. I cannot regulate it. I cannot prolong it or make it. So you see, that means there also we have no control. It doesn't depend upon myself. But in between B and D, there is C, and C stands for choice. Choice, and choice is under my control. I can control my choice. So everything, most of our thinkings, most of our activities depend upon our own choice. So by virtue of our own choice, we can minimize our problems, minimize our problems and crises. My dear friends, especially during the last 5 months, the whole human race is experiencing such a situation. They don't know what is happening now, what will happen tomorrow. So what is happening to myself, what will happen to me, what will happen to my family members, to my colleagues, I don't know. What will happen to our state, our country, we don't know. So in such a situation, it is really a very alarming situation for the people in academics like you and I, that we should try to maintain, to create such an environment that people become aware of that yes, it happens, but it is not that this is not the end of our journey. We will have to tackle this situation. I hope the deliberations of the three distinguished speakers and the interactions with the very learned participants, even organized by the Department of Philosophy of our university will be a meaningful one. I wish all the success of the event. And once again, I thank the organizers and I welcome once again my respected friend, Professor Vijay Tiburua from IIT, Professor Nirimal Narayan Chakraborty from Rabindra Bharati, Kolkata, and Professor Daniel Rabe from Tel Aviv University of Israel, and also other participants to this virtual platform. With these words, let me take the privilege of declaring that this one-day event is being inaugurated. Ayam Arambha Shubhaya Bhavatuhu. May this beginning for the well-being of all. Thank you. Namaskar.
Thank you very much, our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Deepak Kumar Sharma sir, for your valuable words, your valuable opinion on today's main theme of the webinar on existential crisis during this pandemic. Sir, thank you very much once again. Now, we would like to proceed. Invited as chief guest and keynote speaker of today's webinar, Professor Bijoy Hatiborwa sir from IIT Delhi. Before going to listen sir's lecture, I would like to request Ms. Arpana Ramchiari to introduce Professor Bijoy Hatiborwa sir with a short bio. Arpana, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Papariborwa. Good morning, all. I'm very honored to introduce Professor Bijoy Hatiborwa sir. He taught in IIT Kanpur for 21 years and in IIT Delhi for 9 years in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences. He got retired in 2018 and joined IIT Ropar as visiting professor. He was fellow Indian Institute of Advanced Study, Shimla in 1997. He was senior Fulbright fellow in University of Texas at Austin in 2002 to 2001. His area of interest are philosophical aesthetics, philosophy of mind, metaphysics of the self. With this fantastic bio, may I request the chief guest of today's webinar, Professor Bijoy Hatiborwa sir, to deliver his keynote speech. So over to you, sir.
Good morning to everyone.
Good morning, sir.
And special thanks to Papuri Borua for this invitation. It's a classical university towards which this address is being given. So my honorable gesture towards this institution of classical studies. I have taken the humanities as the nodal point of this keynote address. I don't think it provides you with any particular key to the problem. It is just a particular reflection on the current scenario. So I start here with certain remarks about epidemics and pandemics as humanitarian crisis. As much as they are subjects of biomedical concern or concerns of biologists and medical experts, great thinkers in contemporary times, such as Giorgio Agamben, Slavoj Zizek, Noam Chomsky, Jean-Luc Nancy, all these great critiques of contemporary times have spoken about this particular problem in very significant terms. And such comments demonstrate how the humanities contribute to the understanding of such a crisis by crucially supplementing the biomedical paradigm of reading this particular disease. So the biomedical paradigm is one reading, and the reading attempted here is from the humanities paradigm. The most prominent contribution from the humanities comes, of course, from literary fiction. That's the core of the humanities. Indeed, literary texts and the arts have represented human suffering since ancient times. We have witnessed in recent times, particularly as a result of the coronavirus pandemic, a heightened interest in what is known as plague fictions, such as, just for a few examples, Daniel Defoe's A Journal of the Plague Year, Mary Shelley's The Last Man, Albert Camus' The Plague, Jack London's The Scarlet Plague. Well, these are just a few. There are many more. Besides, interest has also been arrested by the numerous eco-disaster fiction of Margaret Atwood, Stephen King, Jim Crace, and Cormac McCarthy, amongst others. At this point, a small philosophical analysis is called for regarding the representation of a crisis and suffering in literary fiction. How is a literary representation of a crisis and suffering distinct from a non-literary account of the same phenomenon of the human condition? I shall try to answer this question by drawing a distinction between what a crisis or suffering is. I should underline the word is, what a crisis or suffering is. Between this and what a crisis or suffering is like, and I underline the word like. So what something is and what something is like. This distinction can be generalized into, as I said, what something is and what something is like. And this general distinction relates to contexts that are non-experiential matters of fact and experiential phenomena, respectively. I have a small example with which to explain. Take the case of a stone, an ordinary piece of stone. So you can ask what being a stone is, or what a stone's being a stone is. And of course, the answer will be given in terms of its material constitution, what constitutes a stone. But if you are, for example, hurt by a stone which is thrown at you, you are hit and hurt by a stone thrown at you by someone, then if I were to ask you what your being hit by a stone is, this would be a rather odd way of asking, because your being hit by the stone implies your experience of being hurt by the impact of the stone. Now the difference is, whilst the former question, that means what being a stone is, that former question is purely ontological, and its answer is also ontological. By ontological, what I mean is, it's a question about the being of the stone, and the answer is given by describing or analyzing the being of the stone. But the latter question, which is what your being hit by a stone is, which is, of course, ill-phrased. This latter question is entirely misunderstood if it is taken to be ontological. Why? Well, the reason, the former one is an objective question, demanding an objective answer. An objective question about the being of the stone, deserving an objective answer about its being. An objective answer, of course, is a scientific idea, whereas the latter one is a subjective or experiential question that invites an epistemological answer. So it's not an ontological question, it is epistemological, and the answer is also epistemological. Therefore, what is pertinent to ask about the latter case, you're being hit by a stone, would be what you're being hit and hurt by the stone is like. Now, the addition of this particular word like makes all the difference. And the same thing can be paraphrased as what it is like to be hit and hurt by a stone. I think it becomes quite clear from our ordinary examples. If you, for instance, eat a particular fruit, which I have never eaten, I could ask you, what is it like? What the taste is like? And of course, the answer is an experiential answer, because only on the basis of the experience, the subjective experience, would the answer be forthcoming. There is no objective answer to it in terms of ease. It is, and what it is like neatly fits into the disciplinary difference between science and the humanities, respectively. I mean, science is more about what something is, and the humanities, especially the core humanities, are more concerned with the subjective dimension of what life is like or what a particular event is like, and so on. So if we come to the question of COVID-19, what COVID-19 is as a disease, certainly it is a scientific problem requiring a scientific description or scientific explanation. On the other hand, if someone were to ask what it is like for an individual or for a community to live in the time of COVID-19, to be affected by it, to be influenced by it, then of course the question exceeds or supersedes the scientific problem. There is a scientific problem, but this formulation of the question exceeds or supersedes, goes beyond the scientific dimension. The question directly addresses itself to the subjective experiential dimension, within which lie the various existential implications of life in the midst of the pandemic. Literature, as a primary constituent of the humanities, is occupied with the subjective experiential dimension of this existential crisis. In its narrative and poetical engagement with language, literary fiction captures fear and suffering in their lived existential reality. As an example, we may refer to a very famous illustration, what I had already mentioned in naming various fictions, plague fictions, and this one is Jack London's The Scarlet Plague, written many, many years ago, more than a century ago, in 1915, which narrates the general public's fear of the invisible world of microorganisms. Here I have a quotation from that novel. I quote, "The heart began to beat faster and the heat of the body to increase. Then came the scarlet rash, spreading like wildfire over the face and body. Most persons never noticed the increase in heat and heartbeat. And the first they knew was when the scarlet rash came out. Usually, they had convulsions at the time of the appearance of the rash. But this convulsions did not last long and were not very severe. The heels became numb first, then the legs and hips. And when the numbness reached as high as his heart, he died, unquote. Well, this is the kind of description, narrative representation of a critical condition, of an experiential scenario that ends in a tragic death. Furthermore, one of the characters of in the novel, Granzer, tells his grandsons how the people started to run away from the cities in a blind panic. So here is another scenario with a quote. Thursday night, the panic outrush of the country began. Imagine my grandsons. So the grandfather is telling the grandsons, imagine my grandsons, people thicker than the salmon run you have seen on the Sacramento River, pouring out of the cities by millions, madly over the country, in vain attempts to escape the ubiquitous death. You see, they carried the germs with them. Even the airships of the rich, fleeing for mountain and desert fastness, carried the germs. Now you can see the imagery here. Salmon fish in millions, as it were, jumping around in the sea. In the same way, people, affected people, jumping death, and wouldn't leave them wherever they would run away. Even the richest people who would flee for mountains and desert isolation, somehow the germ would stick to them like ghostly accompaniments. So that is another example. I have one more, the third one and the last one from Jack London's. Here, as the human race in Jack London's fictional world was dying out of plague, the earth was being devastated by fires and conflagrations. So this is the last quotation from the novel. The smoke of the burning filled the heavens, so that the midday was as a gloomy twilight. And in the shifts of wind, sometimes the sun shone through dimly, a dull red orb. Truly, my grandsons, it was like the last days of the end of the world, unquote. Now, listen, the end of the world. This is how the pandemic was perceived or depicted in the novel. It is not just that people feared their own death. They also experienced the terrible feeling of being at the end of the world. As the cities were being destroyed by rampant fire, the people were fleeing away hysterically. And since communications with the rest of the world had come to a dreary halt, the panic had become immense and unprecedented, becoming a hopeless signal of death. There is a quotation, small quotation. It was exactly as if the world had ceased, exactly as the world had been blotted out, unquote. Now, this is a point of departure. At this point, we can return to a little more philosophical analysis for the sake of clarifying the dichotomy of what it is and what it is like. Bertrand Russell is very famous for having drawn the distinction between knowledge by description and knowledge by acquaintance. It's a very important epistemological to empirical knowledge, not to mathematical sort of knowledge. For example, if I know something by description, let's say the New York City by description, a place that I have never visited, then as far as knowledge, my knowledge of the New York City is concerned, I'm at a distance from what it is that I know of. Distance because that distance would be met, that gap would be closed only if I have a perceptual experience of the city. But I now only have a knowledge by description of the city. But if I know it by acquaintance, that means perceptual acquaintance by visiting, then there is no distance between me, the subject of knowledge, and the what it is that I know, namely the city, because that would be experiential knowledge, knowledge by perceptual experience, and Russell called it knowledge by acquaintance. Now, what is subjective or experiential is by definition an instance of knowledge by acquaintance for the subject of the experience. Science, including social science, provides knowledge of social reality mostly by description. What about literature's relation to social reality or the human condition from the standpoint of knowledge? That's the question here. Certainly, literature does not have a descriptive intention, that is knowledge by description, but it engages in what I call narrative construction of the human condition in the matrix of a fictional world. However, the fictional narrative is constitutive of a human world with characters and events. And I emphasize it's constitutive of a human world. It is as though the human world is constituted with characters and events. And we, the readers, are taken in, arrested by the narrative process, whereby we, as it were, become the subjects who have a first personal acquaintance with the existential momentum of the fictionally generated human condition. And that's the magic of literature, that as readers, we could be taken in and turned into subjects who have a first personal acquaintance with what is otherwise entirely a fictional world. However, the fictional narrative is, yes. This is why literature is supremely relevant to our understanding of what it is like for humanity to endure through the time of an existential crisis, whether the crisis is that of a pandemic or of a world war or some natural calamity or something like the event 9/11, whatever it could be. So it becomes a big context for our knowledge of what to be a human being or a human community in the midst of such a crisis. And that's why there was all that discussion about the difference between what it is and what it is like. Now I move on to another point of departure, which is another kind of contribution that literature makes, which is about how fictional narratives influence people's worldview. Here I have the pleasure of resorting to or invoking Albert Camus, his famous novel, The Plague, published in 1947, that deals with existential crisis in the context of an epidemic, the same plague. Camus was not drawn to the theme of the plague as a historical crisis in humanity. Rather, he was drawing attention to the fact that the actual historical incidents we call plagues are a dramatic reminder of a perpetual rule, a dramatic reminder of a universal rule of the human condition. This is a very important point. That he is talking about plague, but plague is not so much, it is not so much about a historical event, but it's more like a symbolic, a symbol of something which is of perpetual interest to us, interest in the sense of what would be perpetually true of us. Namely, under by a bacillus or a natural calamity or an accident or a global war or even the actions of our fellow human beings. This is the rule. Vulnerable to being randomly exterminated. Our exposure to plague is, at bottom, an encounter with the truth that our lives are fundamentally on the edge of what Camus termed the absurd. In the novel, in this novel, Camus places two important characters. He creates two important characters, and they are placed in antinomical relation to one another. Their standpoints are antinomical. One character, who is a Catholic priest called Panelu, the priest gives a sermon to the city of Oran. City of Oran is, a city in the French-Algerian city where the setting of this plague is done. So this Catholic priest is sermonizing there, and his sermon is, he is sermonizing in a cathedral of the main square of the city. And what he does is he seeks to explain the plague as God's punishment for human depravity. But there is a counter character who is Albert Camus' hero, in fact, and that is Dr. Rieu, the protagonist of the novel. Dr. Rieu, who loads this sort of theological outlook that the plague is a result of God's punishment. He loads this sort of outlook. So when Dr. Rieu witnesses a young, innocent child dying in the very hospital where he works, the doctor comes to terms with his conviction, with his belief that suffering is entirely randomly distributed in the human world. There is no underlying moral order or ethical force, which is to say that the human reality is simply absurd. That's Camus' position. Well, given this absurdity, a very important question arises. How does one justify one's living a life against the perpetual possibility and absurdity of random death? If we are knowledgeably vulnerable to this perpetual truth, then how does one really negotiate with the world? How does one live? How does one justify one's life? Dr. Ryu works tirelessly against death. As a doctor, he does that. And he tries to mitigate the suffering of those around him. Tirelessly, he does it. Of course, this is not the dedication of service in saintly heroism. He is no saint. This is not an example of saintliness. It is in this context that Camus makes what is perhaps the most remarkable comment in the entire novel. And here I have, it's a short comment. I quote, and this is, of course, the voice of the doctor. The whole thing is not about heroism. Somebody asks him about this question of justification of life to the doctor. So he answers, the whole thing is not about heroism. It is about decency. It may seem a ridiculous idea, but the only way to fight the plague is with decency, unquote. Everyone would raise this question now. What exactly is decency that Camus, through Dr. Ryu, is talking about? And the question is raised by another character in the novel. Dr. Ryu responds in a sentence as it is eloquent. So it's a very eloquent and clipped response. I quote, Doctor response. In general, I can't say. But in my case, I know that it consists in doing my job. So the answer to the question, what exactly is decency in this context, in this kind of a context, in this kind of an absurd context, absurd, meaningless context, the answer to the question of decency is, well, I can't say very much about the whole thing, but in my own case, decency consists in doing my job. These three words, job. So according to me, in other words, human negotiation with the absurdity of existence is a defiant but generous attitude of doing my job, which is an obligation springing from one's groundless choice. And I say groundless choice, an obligation springing from groundless choice, because the choice that is being made doesn't come from any kind of essence, as Jean-Paul Sartre is so famous in his existentialist remark, existence precedes essence. So there is bare existence without any essence, in which case a choice is a choice bereft of its grounding in any essence would be only a groundless choice. A pandemic or epidemic may end someday, and people would return to relish the pleasure of normalcy. The invention of a vaccine may bring the deadly virus under control, and waves of joy may return to the humanity. This sounding optimism. However, if this is a chronicle of optimism, this chronicle could not be a story of definitive human victory over viral contagion. And Albert Camus here speaks in this very novel through the voice of Dr. Ryu. Here the point is that in the city of Oran, the plague is over, normalcy returns. So people are beginning to be joyful about normal life. But then there is this warning, and this warning is coming, very insightful warning is coming through the voice of Dr. Yu. I quote here, "As he listened to the cries of joy that arose above the town, Ryu recalled that this joy was always under threat. He knew that this happy crowd was unaware that one reads in books, which is that the plague bacillus never dies or vanishes entirely. Entirely. That there can never be safety against perpetual susceptibility to sudden death, which can render our lives instantaneously meaningless, is absolutely granted. Let's take it as absolutely granted. However, it is not in spite of this general truth, but precisely because of this truth that Camus thinks we need to feel obliged to love the damned fellow humans because they are damned by this perpetual vulnerability. To work without hope or despair for the mitigation of suffering. So Albert Camus speaks to us in our own time, in as much as he alerts us to what it is like to endure the journey of being a human being in the human, given a fundamental vulnerability that tends to make life absurd or meaningless. More significantly, through a character like Dr. Ryu, Camus shows what it is like to live through that fundamental human vulnerability in the manner of exemplary decency. That means you have to live through this fundamental vulnerability, but what it is to live through this vulnerability with exemplary decency. And Doctor's character is an illustration of that exemplary decency. The manner of life is exemplary precisely because the Doctor represents the inimitable character of a human individual who turns life from being a hospital into a hospice. The difference between a hospital and a hospice is that a hospital is the conventional way of treating a patient to heal, but a hospice is a far more radical form of hospitality in the sense that if the patient is a dying patient, it's a terminal case, then you do your best possible kind of hospitality to give solace. So that's the sort of exemplary decency by virtue of which you turn life from a hospital into a hospice. Now I come to the very end part, and I now invoke a third great literary figure with which I conclude. And this great literary figure is a living legend of literature. Orhan Pamuk, the Turkish writer who won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 2006. Pamuk has been engaged in writing a historical novel entitled Nights of Plague. I mean, he is still writing. And this novel, Nights of Plague, set in the 1901 time during what is known as the Third Plague pandemic, which is an outbreak of bubonic plague that killed millions of people in Asia and quite some in Europe. That's his setting. Pamuk refers to pandemics of the past centuries and contrasts them with what we currently have been undergoing due to the coronavirus pandemic. Plague and pestilence were rather frequent calamities in the ancient world. And ordinary people were either witness to the horror or they heard vivid and scary reports about their terrible ravages. What had fueled immense fright in them, in people, was a belief in the supernatural origin of pandemics, which were often believed to be provoked by offenses against divinities. Now, that's a familiar story we know. Referring to Daniel Defoe's famous A Journal of the Plague Year, Pamuk talks about how the novel shows us that underlying people's remonstrance and rage against local administration for mismanagement in the time of such a pandemic, there was also an anger against fate or the divine will that witnesses and perhaps even condones all the death and human suffering. This rage of the people against divinity also extended into one against the institutions of organized religion, like the churches, that seem unsure how to deal with any of it. Now, at that time, living in a world without newspapers, television or internet, hardly with any media, and people with hardly any literacy, such people had only their imagination with which they could conceive of imminent danger and its tormenting possibilities. In Pamuk's consideration, this reliance on imagination in ancient times, I quote, gave each person's fear its own individual voice and imbued it with a lyrical quality, localized, spiritual, and mythical, unquote. Now, the point Pamuk is making here is that when something like this crisis or experience is left only to your imagination rather than to widespread scientific information, then you would be, your sense of fear would have a very individual character rather than a very scientifically based common collective character. So, and also there might be some sadly lyrical quality to it, to this very localized, very spiritual and very mythical characterization of that fear, of that fright. Like the mythology of evil itself, I mean, the mythology of evil is familiar to everyone, plague was portrayed as something caused by an outside agent and with malicious intent. There would be everyday rumor about some malevolent, demonic presence in the dark, smearing plague-infected liquid on various places and on various objects all over. As with the old plague pandemics, now I'm coming to the modern pandemic. As with the old plague pandemics, there have also been unfounded rumors and accusations based on nationalist, religious, ethnic, and regionalist identity in the wake of the present coronavirus outbreak. For instance, there have been so much rumor about, say, the Chinese being the origin of it, or some particular place being responsible for sending it out with malicious intent. So such things show that history repeats itself. However, there is some difference now. Today we have access to a greater volume of reliable information about the pandemic we are living through. Our fear is fed less by rumors and determined more by relatively accurate scientific information. We have so much of biomedical, well-grounded information. Hence, the character of the fear we feel is different from the fear felt in ancient times. So what is this difference in the character of fear that we feel in comparison to the past? Pamuk says something about it. I quote, and this is a very significant quotation. The terror we are feeling, however, excludes imagination and individuality, unlike the earlier ancient terror. And it reveals how unexpectedly similar our fragile lives and shared humanity really are. Fear, like the thought of dying, makes us feel alone. But the recognition that we are all experiencing a similar anguish draws us out of our loneliness. So even though we might feel lonely, the realization that everyone is going through it makes us be free from that loneliness. Unquote. Since we know today that the whole humanity from Thailand to New York, as it were, shares our anxieties about safety and sanitation, about life in and out of quarantine, the shared knowledge along with shared response begets, according to Pamuk, a sense of solidarity. This is the central point. It begets a sense of solidarity. We fear, no doubt, but because of the sense of solidarity, because we are not alone in this global crisis, Pamuk says, I quote him, we discover a humility in it, in that we discover a humility in it that encourages mutual understanding, unquote. Now, this is like a breeze of optimism in an otherwise depressing atmosphere of global humanity. How do we individually and collectively come to terms with our fearful concerns? Pamuk talks about two distinct responses that fear elicits in him, and perhaps fear elicits in all of us. So this is a very personal response. And he says, I quote, sometimes it causes me to withdraw into myself towards solitude and silence. But other times it teaches me to be humble and to practice solidarity. So this oscillation between solitude and silence on the one hand and solidarity on the other to this fear is like, and probably our response too. So I come to the very end of it. At the end of this tunnel of existential crisis, would there emerge a better world? I conclude by voicing what Pamuk says. Again, this is the ending quotation. We must embrace and nourish the feelings of humility and solidarity engendered by the current moment, unquote. And thank you very much. That's my end.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Bijoy Hatibarua, sir, for enlightening us so many new ideas on human existential and suffering. You have informed that you have joined with us for some time, and we are very thankful to you, sir, that we are also glad to have the opportunity
He's also working at the Faculty of Arts, Rabindra Bharati University, Kolkata. He's also working as the director, IQAC, Rabindra Bharati University. Professor Nirmala Naran Chakravarti sir was also the visiting fellow of various universities, both in India and abroad. But he was also the visiting faculty of the Department of Philosophy, University of Glasgow, Scotland, UK. He was also the visiting faculty of University of Pune, University of Hyderabad, Assam University, Silchar, and University of Naples, Italy. Professor Nirmala Naran Chakravarti sir has published a number of valuable books. Some of them are The Language, Truth and Reality, published by Rabindra Bharati University, Calcutta. He also published the book The Value in Defense of Intrinsic Value of Nature, New Age, published by New Age, Calcutta. Different aspect of environmental concern by Rabindra Bharati University, etc. Professor Nirmala Chakravarti sir also published a number of valuable articles in different international and national reputed journals, like Tagore, An Idea of Emancipation, published in the Cambridge Companion to Rabindranath Tagore, Cambridge University Press. Methodology in Indian Philosophy, published in Routledge History of Indian Philosophy, 2008. On behalf of the Department of Philosophy, Kumar Bhattacharya Sanskrit and Ancient Studies University, I warmly welcome you, sir, for giving us your valuable time in spite of your busy schedule. Now, with your permission, I request you, sir, to deliver your lecture. Over to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Am I audible?
You are audible.
Okay, okay. Well, good afternoon, everybody. And Honorable Vice Chancellor, and everybody else in that university, I extend my sincere thanks to all of you. And I would like to especially congratulate my younger colleagues in the philosophy department who have taken this trouble to organize this webinar in this extremely difficult time that we are going through. what I shall share with you today are some thoughts, some ideas that I keep on, articulating. I keep on thinking while looking at how people are responding to this pandemic and how people are trying to cope with this. So these are some apparently not coherent thoughts that I might present before you. I was listening to Professor Barua's lecture, a very wonderful presentation of some of the important literary figures, how this kind of pandemic has been represented by them, and how the human aspect of it has been highlighted beautifully by these literary figures. What I would like to do is rather look at it from a philosophical perspective, and I would like to see how a kind of view of man emerges out of our looking at this pandemic, out of our attempts to address this pandemic in our individual as well as social life. Throughout the history, it has been found that when mankind faces a profound crisis, man has tried to understand and address the crisis in very many different ways. And one of the best expressions of this, insofar as intellectual domain is concerned, could be found in the works of philosophers. Philosophy, with its synoptic, critical, and Catholic attitude, has tried to articulate man's location vis-a-vis the pandemic. The present pandemic situation is no different. Facing a crisis is the real test of an individual as well as of a community. Philosophers, with their analytical acumen, are expected to decipher the crisis and also to understand man's response to it. In my understanding, there are two elements which are important to understand man's ability to cope with this crisis. One is universality, and the second is uncertainty. I shall try to argue that these two elements of universality and uncertainty are key to understanding the crisis, to understanding man's response to this crisis. And out of this understanding, an idea of man vis-a-vis the world would also emerge. And unlike Anu, as wonderfully represented by Professor Brua, I would like to end with a rather optimistic note. What we have seen in the last few months is how this pandemic has affected the entire world, the rich and the poor, the mighty and the weak. A country that boasts of being the biggest military power on earth has witnessed mass grave where nameless people have been buried without the knowledge of the loved ones. So you can see the helplessness of even the so-called the mighty nation in the world. The sheer number of deaths was unmanageable. Pandemic has dragged countries in desperation. Also, we are not certain when and how long this pandemic will affect us and to what extent. At the global level, conflicting opinions are pouring in with regard to the extent of the spread and the devastating effect of the virus. Some are even talking about the second wave of the virus. To me, these elements, first, universality, second, uncertainty, create a breeding ground of human anxiety, leading to a deeper existential crisis. Many things exist in the world, but only humans can raise questions about his existence. This clearly sets humans apart from other things. Second, things exist mean things can be used by humans to achieve some purpose. Humans at a certain level can also be said to exist as a means of humans also can be said to have some instrumental existence. But this does not exhaust of humans. Human existence transcends this means goal centric limit. If one looks at the direction of the unfolding of human civilization, it is clear that humans constantly try to move beyond instrumentality. Man certainly does not want to be a machine that is determined to act in a certain way. Man wants to exercise his own creativity in exploring the surrounding world, and in doing so, also understand himself more and more. This urge is universal and gets manifest in varieties of ways in all the human communities. The essence of man does not consist in any fixed, determined characteristics. Man is eternally discontent with what is given. This restlessness is the mark of humans. While perpetually standing in front of the ever-expanding possibility of the horizon, man entertains the attitude of wonder. And from failures, he also focuses on his being. Man is the latest entry to the world. He is not satisfied with animal existence. His creative impulse makes him restless. This restlessness drives him to explore the nature in greater and greater detail. Science is the result of this attitude. Although science aims at being objective, it is a human enterprise. This objective inquiry is driven by man's unstoppable urge to open out new vistas. Philosophers of science, since Thomas Kuhn, have tried to argue scientific enterprise is not free from extra scientific influences. And as a result of paradigm shift, it is difficult to make sense of comparing one scientific theory with another. The contents of scientific truths are free from man's influence, and so justification of such truths are also not dependent on human will, but the direction and contour of scientific enterprise is to a great extent determined by human interest and purpose. The explosion of the atomic energy is certainly directed by human purpose. Nonetheless, the content of the laws of atomic theories are free from human intervention, and these laws could be justified without any reference to human interest. When scientists discovered the atomic energy, they were overwhelmed by the thought that this massively powerful energy could be used to serve good for humanity, or it could be used to destroy mankind. Theoretical exploration per se is neutral, but scientific theories are verified and justified in terms of their consequences, and the consequences certainly profoundly affect man. And this is where the existential question crops up. If man exists not just to be manipulated as a machine, if man's urge to express himself in a variety of ways is to be accounted for, then one has to take into account man's constant questioning his own being and beings of others. Through this constant questioning, man's being is in constant flux. It is a process of becoming. But this process of becoming is not a linear process. The failures and letdowns are abundant in man's journey to becoming. But this has never stopped man from questioning and exploring his being. From disappointments and dissatisfactions, man stands up with greater vigor and resoluteness and proceeds with greater determination. This unending succession of triumphs and failures are expressions of man's attempt to understand his being. From the cave paintings to modern technological wonders, all these are manifestations of man's effort to understand his own existence. Since the dawn of civilization, every attempt of man to understand his being is fraught with crisis. He is making his own way, not confident where the way would lead him to. But his insatiable thirst of moving ahead makes him find his way to meandering through the maze. Crisis appears following the urge to know or to act. It is a state of indecision. Indecision emerges from lack of certainty. An omniscient being does not suffer from uncertainty. Nor does an animal, I believe, face a crisis. Man falls in between and so undergoes the crisis. Man finds himself in the world without any choice, so to say. But the uniqueness of man is that he does not remain content in finding himself in the world. Man is an animal, and so he has got his animal needs for sure. But then man tries to transcend his animal needs. This excess element makes man question his being, and so the crisis is felt. When we talk of existential crisis, this crisis could be about the possible annihilation of our existence, or about profound transformation of our existence. If death is certain, then embracing certainty looks obvious. But precisely here, the quandary begins. Being intellectually certain does not allay our apprehension. If death is not an event within life, for life ends in death, then conceptually life does not concern with death. Our fear of death comes out of our desire to live and also to lose our loved ones. In the face of pandemic, this fear gets heightened. There are two reasons behind this heightening. One, since we are fighting against an enemy, namely the virus, we are not sure when and where the virus will attack. The sudden and silent attack might bring in death. Death knocks at our door, so to say, as if it can call any one of us. Life and all its projects could come to an end abruptly. Two, the emotional relation that we grow during the years with our loved ones seems severely threatened. When man is thrown into the world, he comes alone, but then he weaves bonds with people around him. His being gets inalienably associated with others. His life projects get intertwined with others. This generates social morality in its different aspects. It gets difficult to distinguish one's being from the beings of others. The arrival of pandemic quivers the entire form of web, and the possibility of unannounced arrival of death wobbles the otherwise stable being. In the absence of a definitive treatment, we are at loss. We suddenly are blinded like an animal caught in front of headlights of a car. This is crisis because we do not know how we got here, and also we do not know for certain how we can overcome this crisis. This is existential because we ponder over our beings, and our beings are related to beings of others. Thus, the entire human race gets threatened. We feel helpless because we find ourselves in this world and we are not given any choice. In our being, we construct our being in the process of becoming by relating us to fellow beings. Under lockdown and other restrictions, we are severed from other beings. Our movements have been severely restricted. It is getting difficult even to collect daily needs like food. We are leading a life that is thrust upon us, but again we try to console ourselves that this restriction is beneficial for us. Our familial relations are under strain. We feel there is a constant gaze of the state over our existence. Children are not allowed to go out. Students are not allowed to attend the educational institutions. Senior citizens are advised to confine them within their home. We do not entertain friends and guests at our home anymore. Everybody is maintaining what we call a social distance. Everybody is suspicious of everybody else. The other, quote unquote, is treated as untouchable. The news media constantly pours in the statistics of infected people and dead. The feeling generated is that we are all heading toward doomsday. The human mind cries, why all this? No answer is available at macro level. Clinically, people can have an existential crisis when they start questioning what life means and what is the purpose of life as a whole. For the salaried middle class, at least in India, the pandemic produces a guilt, since a large number of people in unorganized sector faces tremendous problems, sometimes leading to death, while the salaried middle class is more or less unaffected. I quote, I could have been one of these people walking down the railway track to return home and then got killed in a train accident. This kind of thought is deeply unsettling for me and for my near and dear ones. It is a series of accidental events that puts me in a comfortable situation where I am today. And we all know things in life can change dramatically, even without giving a hint of the upcoming changes. The fear of losing a loved one or facing the reality of one's own death is very scary indeed. The visuals that are portrayed in the news media generates the fear of death that hovers over us constantly. We are all familiar with the event of death, but the pandemic intensifies this fear because of its all-pervading tentacles and uncertainty of time of attack. It comes with a whisper and stifles us within days. Man has been struggling with the idea of death since time immemorial. During the pandemic, this struggle becomes too real and overpowering. There are statistics to suggest that lockdown has increased domestic violence, feeling of loneliness. Though it has been a cliche that man is a social animal, the significance of this cliche has been realized by all of us when we were told to be confined within our homes for months. Communicating with others, sharing one's space of feelings and frustrations, or telling others one's own little experiences that are otherwise insignificant also makes one's existence lighter to carry. Inability to do this turns people restless. Loneliness could be excruciatingly painful. Senior citizens living on their own are witness to this. The universality of the threat of pandemic, coupled with the looming uncertainty of life, leads man to ask about the nature of his own existence. The very attempt to raise this question is, I think, itself a silver line. Since the more committed and sincere we are in our attempt to explore our being, the more our becoming will flourish. No doubt, grief and agony will accompany us all the way. But this pain and suffering will churn out, hopefully, new ways of becoming. Man's creativity will thrive in 1,000 ways. Man's figure cannot be removed from the altar of the decrepit temple of civilization. To suffer is to become. To become is to free oneself from the fetter of the immediate given. And perhaps then man can sing, "Blessed was the pain, blessed was the throbbing." To exist is to suffer, and to suffer is a privilege that humans possess. With this optimistic note, I would like to end. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Nirmaila Narayan Chakraborty, sir, for such a thought-provoking lecture on existential crisis during this pandemic time, and how universality and uncertainty helps us to understand the crisis and man's response to this crisis. So thank you very much for your valuable words. Now, I would like to request Professor Daniel Rabe, sir, to deliver his lecture. Before that, I would like to introduce Professor Daniel Rabe, sir, in front of you with a short bio. So Professor Daniel Rabe, sir, is a professor in philosophy at Tel Aviv University. He is the author of 3 books, Exploring the Yoga Sutra, Philosophy and Translation, published Continuum 2012, Sutras, Stories and Yoga Philosophy, published by Routledge 2016, and Vyakrishna and 20th Century Indian Philosophy, published by Bloomsbury 2020. Now, may I request Professor Rabe, sir, deliver his lecture. Sir, over to you.
Can you hear me? Papuri, can you hear me?
Yes, sir, you are audible, and welcome you, sir, to this webinar.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
So good morning from Tel Aviv. I'm 2.5 hours behind you. Good morning from Tel Aviv, 5,467 kilometers from Nalbari. This is magic, sheer magic. No flight or train or bus, just a link, and you are sitting together, thinking together. If anything positive came out of the pandemic, this is it. In the late 1990s, I came upon a book by Daya Krishna. I wonder if you even heard his name. At the Tel Aviv University Soraski Library. It was his Indian philosophy, a counter perspective, published in 1991. I was totally captivated by the book. It was not just the intriguing content comprising of a new reading of classical Indian philosophy, but the way it was written. I could feel that something was happening in the book. In retrospect, this happening can be formulated through Daya Krishna's own distinction between thinking and thought in his essay, Thinking versus Thought, Strategies for Conceptual Creativity, from 1988. Here he makes a distinction between thinking as a dynamic, continuous, living process and thought as a tentative product of thinking. For him, books and essays are just stops on the thinking journey, or to which the reader can look into the author's creative thinking flow. Work as an open invitation for the reader to come on board and take active part in this flow, which according to the Krishna is neither mine or yours, but a collective striving. Collective striving or collective thinking. This is why I joined you today. Before I proceed, let me tell you that all of the Krishna's writings and the writings of many other contemporary Indian thinkers that like him correspond simultaneously with classical Indian sources and Western materials, classical and modern, are available at Da Krishna, the open library online. Just Google Da Krishna in Google and a whole intellectual world will open up before you. I'm no expert of COVID-19, and just like you, my whole world changed a few months ago because of the pandemic. But since I was invited to speak to you, let me divide this short talk into 4 rubrics or 4 sections. Section number 1, looking within. Number 2, what thing. Section number 3, social life. COVID-19 and Indian philosophy. Section 1. During COVID days, in the few months, friends, family, students, sort of people that they start tell me, actually meditating. A few minutes in the morning or later in the evening, but I meditate. I think that it makes a lot of sense. Meditation is about looking within. And these days, especially during lockdown, when our outward gaze is limited or more limited than usual, what is left if not looking within? In the Indian context, all of you know all too well, looking within is identified with the yoga traditions. From the Upanishads, Buddhist and Jaina texts, and of course, Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. When exactly and where was this intriguing treatise, the Yoga Sutra, composed? Who is its author? We have no clue. Often in classical Indian philosophy, we have no clue. We know literally nothing or close to nothing biography-wise. Of the greatest authors, artists, and spiritual masters in the Indian history, from the Vedic to the Buddha, from the composers of the Ramayana and the Mahabharata to the artists who painted the remarkable murals of Ajanta and carved the astounding rock temples of Ellora. The questions why Indians chose to remain anonymous, writes Mukund Lat, yet another intriguing voice of contemporary Indian philosophy, is complex, almost metaphysical in its ramifications, unquote. It is almost metaphysical since according to Patanjali and other moksha thinkers, one's true selfhood transcends the phenomenal realm of Namarupa, names and forms. If the purpose of an Anushasana or a handbook, such as the Yoga Sutra, just like the purpose of art, at least according to several prominent exponents of the Rasa theory of aesthetics, is to go beyond the phenomenal self, the day-to-day self, to broaden the borders of, say, Daniel Rave, the not signing one's artwork with a name or not disclosing biographical details pertaining to one's phenomenal self would be the logical conclusion. I would add that the very act of writing has the capacity to carve out of us more than our usual self. It happens that one looks at one's own creation, his or her own text, wonders, where did it come is more to us than we even imagine, not just metaphysically or spiritually, but also aesthetically. Art, including philosophical writing, what Daya Krishna used to call the art of the conceptual, broadens the scope of us as human beings. The Yoga Sutra that you might have heard of or even read, since it has become the Bible of yoga practitioners, both in the West and in India. And by the way, I hope that no one here thinks that Patanjali is just the brand name of Baba Ramdev's business. So if you read the Yoga Sutra, have you read the Yoga Sutra? Short text. It is a short 190-something verses. 90-something because the commentators are not in one mind regarding the authenticity of all the verses. Hence, the number is debatable. And in fact, some will argue, the great Surendranath Das Gupta included, that the whole chapter 4 of the text, is not organic, but probably a philosophical appendix to the first 3 chapters added later. There are many translations of this Sanskrit text to numerous languages, including 3 or 4 translations even to Hebrew, my mother tongue. Patanjali, the 2nd or 3rd century philosopher, opens his treatise with a dramatic statement, Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha. Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha. Yoga is the cessation of the activity of the mind, if you wish. It is dramatic since it stands in sheer contrast to everything we have become used to. Who are we? And what are we used to? We, who imbibed Aristotle's maxim, man is a rational animal, and Descartes, I think, therefore I am. In Patanjali, it is the very opposite. Only when I stop thinking, when my consciousness is empty of any content whatsoever, and my swarupa, as he puts it, can be revealed. But Descartes works not just as a purvapakshin, a philosophical opponent to Patanjali. There is a deep common denominator between the French philosopher and the author of the Yoga Sutra. I shall now close my eyes. Descartes writes in his Meditations on First Philosophy from 641, I shall stop my ears, I shall call away all my senses, I shall efface even from my thought, I shall evase even from my thoughts all the images of corporeal things, or at least, for that is hardly possible, I shall esteem them as vain and false. And thus, only with myself, and considering my own nature, I shall try little by little to reach a better knowledge of and a more familiar acquaintanceship with myself. I'm quoting from his 3rd meditation. This is to say that Descartes does not merely raise the question of identity, who am I, but searches for an answer, just like Patanjali of the Yoga Sutra, within. I shall stop, call away, efface every instance of externality. As far as their initial question and their direction of investigation, namely introversive investigation of the mind by the mind itself, Descartes and Patanjali, in different continents, different philosophical background, and plus minus 1,500 years between them, share a similar path or method. Each of them reaches an entirely different conclusion about the connection, Descartes, or disconnection, Patanjali, between the I think and the I am. We, during COVID-19 days, with everything cloudy at the external level, can join them and look inside and come back to the perennial question of self-identity. Patanjali, let me add, differentiates in his treatise between no less than 6 stages or depths of meditation. The first 2 stages or steps are meditation on the gross, stula, or concrete object. say on this flower here on my desk, or on the figure of a deity, say Krishna or Shiva or Kali. The next two stages consist of meditation on a subtle, sukshma, or abstract object. For instance, a philosophical concept or a certain emotion, say on the concept of time, meditation on time, or on hate, or envy, or love. Stula and sukshma can also be translated as external and internal. Meditation enables us to meet subtle depths within us that are day-to-dayness, which takes all, or at least most, of our attention and energy. Day-to-day mode demands a level of functionality. In meditation, functionality recedes to background, and different aspects of us, of me, can shine forth. I spoke of two stages of meditation on a gross object, then 2 stages of meditation on a subtle object. Why 2? In the first stage, Patanjali writes, language is still present, and so am I, the conventional I, the subject, if you wish, the subject which perceives the object. In the second stage, only the object remains. It colors the consciousness. The subject recedes, clears space. The 5th stage of meditation, I'm still in Patanjali's first chapter of the Yoga Sutra. The fifth stage of meditation, according to Patanjali, is philosophically interesting. Meditation on an object which is so subtle, sukshma, that it has no quality at all. The case, in what way is it still an object? I suddenly remember that I'm speaking here in an online event of Kumar Bhaskar Varma's Sanskrit and Ancient Studies University. Does it mean that all of you, or many of you, are Sanskritists? If you are, I will tell you that the 5th stage of meditation in Patanjali is meditation, samapati, on alinga, or the alinga, the primordial state of prakriti, matter, according to the Sankhya tradition. It is again meditation on a philosophical, is it again meditation on a philosophical concept in accordance with what I said above? The 6th and last stage of meditation is nirbija samadhi, empty meditation. The subject has already dissolved, right? When the object colored or totally filled my consciousness. Now the object too dissolves, and the consciousness of the person who meditates remains empty. What does it mean? What is empty consciousness? Is it possible? I have 2 answers. First, you can meditate and find out yourself by acquaintance, by experience. Second, we can speak about it on some other occasion. I'm hardly a yoga guru, but as a yoga sutra scholar, I have my thoughts on these questions. Indian philosophy and COVID-19, section number 2, Kimashcharyam, what is amazing? One of the themes that the pandemic raises is death. Death. Nirmaya was speaking about death. People die and are afraid of dying. I can die. My close ones can die. This is always the case, but even more so with the virus all around. On Meriting Death is a classical essay by Ramchandra Gandhi, published in 1981. Ramchandra Gandhi, yet another intriguing contemporary Indian philosopher and the grandson of the Mahatma. The event behind this paper, and in a sense behind many of Ramchandra Gandhi's writings, is the assassination of his grandfather, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, the famous Mahatma. In his talk, Moksha and Martyrdom from 2003, another round of thinking on death, with death, apropos the event, the assassination, Ramchandra Gandhi speaks of Gandhi's martyrdom, which is also moksha. Martyrdom, which is also moksha. He underscores the literal meaning of martyrdom from Greek as bearing witness. which he sees as corresponding with the Sanskrit notion of sakshitva, referring to the existential position of the Atma, the selfhood beyond. Hence, according to Ramchandra Gandhi, there is a sense of witnesshood, of more than personal selfhood, as in the notion of the Atman, and drawing on the Katha Upanishad and a Chiketa-like Shraddha, fearless lucidity in the way Gandhi faced or welcomed his death. On Meriting Death is a dialogue, for me at least, on Meriting Death is a dialogue between Ramchandra Gandhi and the Mahatma on death and life, or life in the face of death. Life in the face of death connects to Albert Camus that Bijoy spoke of in the beginning. In On Meriting Death, Ramchandra Gandhi painstakingly examines numerous logical alternatives regarding the killer killed, often but not always, perpetrator-victim relationship. Here, the intriguing question about the relationship between logic and ethics lurks between the lines. He scrutinizes, Ramchandra Gandhi, different views which proclaim the right to kill, as in self-defense, or even the duty to kill, as in mercy killing. His own position is purely ahinsaic, from ahimsa, namely that there is no right whatsoever under any circumstance to kill another. In the midst of a rigorous analysis of different killer-killed situations, Ramchandra Gandhi thinks of a situation in which each of the parties, X and Y, as he puts it, claims his self-defense right to kill the other. And is suddenly reminded of Amitabh Bachchan. Yes, you heard properly, Amitabh Bachchan, the famous Bollywood philosopher Amitabh Bachchan, and mentions him in brackets. Like Amitabh Bachchan, he writes, in the middle of this hardcore paper in logic, a quick detective work which amounts to reading Raghuram Raju's introduction to his edited volume, Ramchandra Gandhi, The Man and His Philosophy, reveals that Ramchandra Gandhi wrote his essay shortly after watching the film Muqaddar Ka Sikandar, 1978, directed by Prakash Mehra. Did any of you see the film? Did you see Muqaddar Ka Sikandar? A scene from the movie inspired the above-mentioned situation discussed in On Meriting Death. It is the final duel scene between protagonist and antagonist, Sikandar and Dilawar, played by Amitabh and Amjad Khan, the hero of heroes and the villain of villains of Bollywood cinema. The twist is that during the battle, both are mortally wounded. They manage to kill each other. Even if Sikandar Amitabh managed to hang on a little longer and reach the wedding of Kamna and Vishal, if you saw the movie. The interconnectedness of Sikandar and Dilawar, I'm coming to the point, the interconnectedness of Sikandar and Dilawar, of good and evil in the face of death, reinforces a sense of reciprocity or non-isolation or advaita, as Ramchandra Gandhi puts it, embedded in his notion of meriting death. In the chapter, What is the Most Amazing Fact in Life, of his last book, of Ramu Gandhi's last book, Swaraj, from 2002, he visits the famous Yaksha Prashna episode from the Mahabharata. Here, I'm sure that you know, Yudhishthir, striving to resurrect his dead brothers, has to answer a series of questions addressed to him by his father, God Dharma, under the guise of a Yaksha, a lake spirit. At the crucial moment of their interaction, Yudhishthir is asked by the Yaksha, Kim Ashcharyam, what is amazing? And he famously answers, day by day living creatures go to Yama's world, while the rest keep looking for something stable. What could be more amazing than this? Commonly, this canonic answer is read as implying that even though death is present all around, day by day living creatures go to Yama's world, the rest, namely those who are still alive, wish for stavara or permanence. Or as Krishna puts it, One may imagine oneself dying, but one can hardly believe it. However, for Ramchandra Gandhi, the ungraspability of one's own death is not the heart of the matter. He's interested, I hinted above, in life in the face of death, which according to him is all about revealing a sense of deathlessness. Deathlessness, not in the sense of not dying, or life without death, since everyone dies, no one is spared. Deathlessness in what sense then? Deathlessness in what sense? Ramchandra Gandhi is unsatisfied with Yudhishthira's answer to the Yaksha's question and offers an alternative answer of his own to the Kimascharyam question. He returns to the interconnection between you and I, revealed in the face of death, the crux of his essay on meriting death. If you and I are not different from one another at the most essential level, the level of humanity, despite the obvious differences between us, and if this deep connection between us, between Sikandar and Dilawar, or even Gandhi and Godse, his assassin, Ramchandra Gandhi, dares to suggest, if this connection is revealed in the face of death, then this difference, non-otherness, ananyata in his vocabulary brings with deathlessness. Even death don't break this deep human connection that paradoxically we often cannot see. Most amazing, Ramchandra Gandhi implies, is that every day people die or go to Yama's abode all around us, but we do not grasp Yama's teaching. We do not see the ananyata that death teaches. We need not wait. One need not wait his own death in order to open one's eyes to the non-otherness, which according to Ramchandra Gandhi is the essence of human existence. In the COVID-19 days, when people die in Israel, India, and everywhere else, we can see, can we see this non-otherness? Can we see this non-otherness? Can we develop a sense of solidarity? Or does the current situation only deepens otherness, alienation, and lack of solidarity? This question takes me to my third section. And don't worry, my last two sections will be much shorter. Section number 3, social blindness. Social blindness. Rajendra Swarup Bhatnagar, yet another original contemporary Indian philosopher who passed away in Jaipur in November 2019. Rajendra Swarup Bhatnagar dedicated the last decade of his writing career to an elaborate reflection on suffering. This is not the place to summarize his contribution, but I will say this. Suffering for Bhatnagar Sahib is first and foremost the suffering of the other. Suffering as a social disease with poverty, privation, exploitation, racism, and torture as its symptoms. Social injustice and not old age, illness, and death. The Buddhist narrative, he suggests, based on the alleged life story of the Buddha, as narrated by the Buddhist tradition, took over the discourse of suffering, or dukkha, at least in the Indian context. Will this evil, dosha, affect me too? Prince Siddhartha asks the royal charioteer when he sees an old man for the first time in his life. I quote from Ashvaghosha's Buddha Charita in Patrick Oliver's translation. On illness, he asks the charioteer, is this an evil, again dosha in Sanskrit, peculiar to him, to the sick person he sees, or is the danger of illness common to every living being? And with regard to a dead body that he sees, he asks, is such the end that awaits every living being? Freedom, moksha, is projected in this narrative as release from the doshas, evils in Oliver's translation, of old age, illness, and death. In the Buddhist narrative, the Buddha seeks a universal remedy for these doshas, or types of suffering, and the particular people that the protagonist meets on his way are shifted from center to periphery. They are just a case study illustrating the broader problem that needs to be solved, namely human life with its inbuilt death sentence. But Nagar Sahib strives to shift his reader's attention back from the universal to the particular. He's not interested in general compassion to every sentient beings. For him, compassion, in order to be compassion, needs a specific addressee, a specific human being that one reaches out to. But Nagar Sahib is critical of the fact that suffering has become identified with old age, sickness, and death, which are natural features of being human, of who we are. Thinking of suffering through these features is for him an instance of our self-centric tendency. But Nagar Sahib aspires and pleads for a more social-centered approach. He is hardly impressed by the hardships of Prince Siddhartha, of princes or queens or kings. He is more concerned with the struggle of poor migrant workers who pitch their tents without electricity, running water, education for their children, 200 meters from his home in the outskirts of Jaipur. Just like me, you have all seen in the last few months the suffering of the migrant workers running away from Delhi and other big cities back to their villages, the same villages that they left for the sake of livelihood. You know what I'm talking about, but how do we cope with poverty philosophically? With poverty? Do we cope with poverty, with exploitation, with social injustice, or do we prefer to keep our eyes wide shut and instead to think and write on the same old, namely Kant and Hegel or Patanjali of the yoga, what I did in the beginning, on the alleged spiritual flair of Indian philosophy, on the beautiful, never on the ugly. But Nagar Sahib and other thinkers I mentioned above, Daya Krishna, Ramchandra Gandhi, wholeheartedly believed that philosophy and philosophizing can and should work for social change. My last very short section, a questioning mind. For many years, I've been connected to JNU, Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi. One of the features that I love the most in JNU is the speaking walls, the murals, the graffiti, painted and written by the students in demand for social justice and protest against injustice, inequality, oppression, and corruption. I see the walls of JNU as a mixture of art, philosophy, and political awareness, not party politics, but multivocal political awareness. Resonating Daya Krishna, who once suggested that intellectuals, academics, professors, students, yes, students, are the conscience keepers of the world, the conscience keepers of the world. I wish to close with 4 graffiti writings from the walls of JNU, inscribed in my memory, not only the walls, but also the walls of my memory. They echo Bhatnagar Sahib's persistent demand that the intellectual descend from the ivory tower and work for the sake of the world. They reflect his belief that the other should always come before me and myself. Here are the graffiti writings. I did not change anything. 1, even after you tied chains of domesticity, shame, and modesty around my feet, even after you have paralyzed me, this fear will not leave you. That even though I cannot walk, I can still think. Struggle for women's liberation. 2, we are all untouchable until no one is. 3, until deers have their own historians. Histories of hunt, we glorify the hunter. This is a great one. Until deers have their own Until deers have their own historians, histories of hunt will glorify the hunter. And finally, we debate, we dissent, we argue, we are GNU. So please do not forget during these days to be critical and reflexive. Today, more than ever, the world needs reflective thinking. The world needs a questioning mind. This is your task. This is our task. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Daniel Ravi, sir, for such a wonderful lecture. So you have mentioned in your lecture the views of Patanjali and the view of Daya Krishna, Ramchandra Gandhi, Katha Upanishad to understand the human existence and crisis during such a pandemic. So, sir, thank you very much. Sir, as you say, yes, with just a link, we are connecting with each other from a long distance from Israel. You are with us. So we are really very happy that you are being with us, and we are very thankful to you, sir. Now, we would like to proceed to our question answer session. So there is one question coming from participants. The name of the participant is Malaya Bora. So she is asking, her question is to Nirmala sir. Sir, are you here?
Okay. Yes, yes. Go ahead.
Okay.
Yes.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. She is asking that Japol sir's existentialism and existential crisis of human beings in the pandemic situation. So do you think that the existentialism of Sartre is relevant to learn in the present situation?
Okay. So shall I respond now?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I didn't specifically refer to Sartre's existentialism because I try to formulate or articulate my own way of responding or understanding the nature of existential crisis, and and the following issues that have cropped up in man's attempt to cope with this kind of crisis. Now, I mean, definitely, Sartre is not the only existentialist philosopher. There are many others, and existentialism of Sartre might differ from existentialism of other existentialist philosophers. So I really don't engage myself into bringing in these names and then try to formulate man's existential crisis as the theme of the present webinar goes. Rather, I'm more interested in how, as a student of philosophy, I am going to articulate, or I'm going to formulate the problem of existential crisis in the present situation, and how, as a student of philosophy, I might respond or I might address to this existential crisis. Okay.
Okay, sir. Thank you very much, sir, for your response. I think participants have no question to other topics. They have not mentioned any question in the sandbox. So we think that we can proceed to our next program. So now I would like to request our chairperson of today's webinar, Dr. Vikas Bhargav Sharma, sir, to speak chairperson's remark. Sir, over to you.
Thank you, Papuri.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. You are audible and also visible.
Technical problem. Because of that, I could not join in that few minutes during my welcome address. So I want to take the privilege once again from my department on behalf of the department and my personal behalf as well as the university, I welcome these three scholars from three great institutions of India as well as Israel. Thank you, sir, to our department as well as to the university. During this crisis period, you are here with us, you have responded our call, and also delivered your very, very interesting and thought-provoking lectures for the listeners, our scholars and research scholars, students, and I hope that all of will be benefited from these. A huge responsibility is entrusted on me by my departmental colleagues to share the technical session. And I don't think that myself is the fifth person to share a session where Professor Nirmaila sir is there, where Bijoy Barua sir is there, and they have delivered a lecture, and Daniel is there. So what I should to conclude my speech, I just try to summarize what Barua sir has said. And Barua sir in his lecture, he rightly mentioned the crisis from the points of view of humanities. And he also systematically analyzed the problem of human suffering and problem of human suffering from the historical point of view till the contemporary period, from in between the modern period, how the problem is looked upon. And crisis and suffering, there are two different and independent issues, as sir has rightly distinguished them and explained this distinction from with the help of various suitable examples. And COVID-19 and various questions regarding the existence and the reflection, he has analyzed the entire reflection from scientific point of view, epistemological point of view, literature point of view, and philosophy of science point of view. So he has rightly elaborated the place of human being in a crisis situation and mentioned Camus and his interpretations on it in a very elaborative and very interesting manner. And he has mentioned a very interesting and very important quote that joy is under threat. And when there is a crisis, then joy of human being comes under a threat, and we have to come out of that. For that, sir has mentioned a very interesting novel and a character, doctor's character, Dr. Rio, and explain the entire deliberation in such a manner. I don't think so any elaboration is required for that. So from my core of my heart, I would like to extend my heartiest thanks to my beloved teacher, a great philosopher, Professor Bijoy Hati Barua sir. And when I come to the lecture of Professor Nirmala Nayan Chakraborty, my another great teacher whom I always adore, whom I listen, particularly if I mention the name, please pardon me, Professor Raghunath Ghosh and Professor Nirmala Nayan Chakraborty from West Bengal. I always find these people very easy, very interesting, and very soft corner for these universities of Northeast. So you are here, sir, with us. Thank you once again. And you have rightly mentioned the crisis in different pandemic, not also only in COVID pandemic, and different pandemic period, how the crisis come out and how philosophers dealt with the question of pandemic and the question of crisis with their analytic argument. The man's response, you rightly pointed out a very interesting issue, that man's response to the crisis, because it is changing from time to time. The men respond at a different level based on their reason and emotion and sentiments, and based on the crisis they have to face. So you talked about universality and uncertainty, which are two key means of response to pandemic, sir, and you also shown different waves of the crisis, and you have rightly mentioned that human anxiety leading to a existential crisis. When there is a pandemic, we always comes under a anxiety, and that leads to a crisis. And you reflected everything on the philosophy of science and its different implications on man. That men are not machine. You have rightly elaborated all this. And Professor Daniel Rave, you have reflected in your talk a very interesting Indian way of looking the issue of existence. And thank you, sir, for being with us from such a long distance. You have measured the distance from kilometer from Israel, your university, to Nalbari. So thank you once again for being with us. And you have rightly elaborated all the pros and cons of the Indian philosophic applications and how to tackle with the problem of crisis. Right from the beginning of Patanjali's Yoga Sutra and till the Upanishads, you are referring also Ramchandra Gandhi and others for explaining the problem of suffering. Even you are referring Gautam Buddha, and you are trying to highlight the problem of poverty, social justice, and you are trying to also to collaborate all these issues with crisis and suffering. So thank you, sir, for your enlightening and thought-provoking lecture. And I don't think so. I always mention that I am not the right person to make a critical analysis on your papers. Just it's a formalities. And thank you once again. Over to Papuri.
Yes, thank you very much, sir, for your valuable opinion. And now I would like to request Ms. Arpana Ramsiari to deliver the vote of thanks. Over to you, Arpana.
Thank you. Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Papuri, for giving me this opportunity. And I'm very privileged to offer this vote of thanks on behalf of the University Fraternity. So first of all, I would like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Deepak Kumar Sharma, sir, for his constant and relentless engaging with its event organized by the university. And today also, he has managed to be with us on this webinar. So thank you so much, sir, for giving us your precious time and gracing the event with your thought-provoking inaugural address. So thank you so much, sir, for being there. Secondly, I would like to thank the Registrar of the University, Dr. Hamidrose Sharma, sir, for his kind support and cooperation in this regard. So thirdly, I would like to thank the Controller of Examination of the University, Dr. Sushant Kumar Kashyap, sir, for his supporting and encouraging us persistently to have such a beautiful webinar throughout. So thank you so much, sir, for making this happen. And now I take this opportunity to offer my sincere gratitude to the chief guest of today's webinar, Professor Bijoy Hatiborwa, sir, for his cognitive presentation and on the humanities crisis, and how he has very briefly and very beautifully mentioned about how fictional narrative influences the existential crisis, and how human beings embodies such structural violences in these unprecedented times. So thank you so much, sir, for joining us and all the way from the Delhi. And again, I'd like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to Professor Nirmala Narayan Chakraborty, sir, for sharing your ideas thoughts on the proposed theme and how people are responding to this pandemic. So thank you so much, sir, for making us enlightened with us with this speech. And I'm very happy to thank you that you are being here with us, and we'd like to meet you soon in our near future for any academic work, sir. So thank you so much, sir, for being there. And thirdly, I'd like to extend my heartfelt thanks to Professor Daniel Rebe for his graceful speech on the looking within social blindness through the way of Indian thoughts and through the way of Yoga Sutra. You have, and so thank you so much, sir, for making us so engaged with. And I truly believe that sir, we'll meet you soon again substantially in our near future. And so thank you so much, sir, for gracing this event and joining us all the way from Israel. So thank you so much, sir, for being there. And I must have to thank IQAC coordinator, Dr. Komola Tresar, for extending his kind support and cooperation in this regard. So thank you so much, sir, for being there. And I must have to thank the very positive, energetic, and beloved head of the department and the chairperson of today's webinar, Dr. Vikas Bhargava Samas, sir, for his constant support and cooperation and contribution towards the departmental events that we are having. So without your support, sir, this webinar would have not been possible to have this one, sir. Thank you so much, sir, for being there. And I would like to thank the coordinator, Dr. Papuri Borua, for organizing such a beautiful webinar on very persistent issues that we are having in this pandemic situation. So thank you so much, Dr. Papuri Borua, for organizing such a beautiful webinar. And I must have to thank the technician of today's webinar, Mr. Bonozid Rafa, for his selfless support, selfless help throughout the webinar. And without his help, this webinar would not have been a successful one. So thank you so much, Bonozid Rafa, for being there. And the last but not the least, I must have to thank all the participants who have been a part of this webinar from all the places of India. Thank you so much for your active participation and your cooperation in this regard. Without participations, without your patience, this webinar would have not been successful one. So thank you all of you once again for joining us and making this webinar a grand success. So thank you so much. So over to Dr. Papuri.
Bye-bye.
Okay.
Thank you, Arpana. Now we are in the end of our program. So I would like to request our chairperson, HOD of the department, Dr. Vikas Bhargava Sharma sir, to formally end up today's program. And thank you all the resource persons. Thank you, Professor Nirmala Narayan Chakraborty sir. Thank you, Vijay Hatiborwa sir and Daniel Rave sir for joining with us today. Sir, over to you, sir, Vikas sir.
Thank you, Papuri. Thank you. See, this is simply a formality. We are at the verge of our entire discussion, and we had a long program around 3.5 hours. I especially thank you all for bearing with us since it's a very hot day, and officially declare from the chairperson that this technician and the entire seminar is closed now. It is over. Thank you all.
Thank you all. Thank you very much, and stay safe and stay healthy.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Sir.
Thank you so much.
We are very proud of you that we are amongst us.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Thank you.
I'm always with you.
Okay, sir. That's
Okay,
our great
sir.
strength for us. That is the strength of the department.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir.